My name is Hernberg-Stahl and I wish you very much welcome to this 12-hour MBA on orphan drugs. So, orphan drugs. What are orphan drugs? Why are we talking about orphan drugs? And why is there specific regulations for orphan drugs? Before the orphan drug legislation was put into place, there were no focus at all on patients with rare diseases. So the objectives with putting a regulation around orphan drugs was to stimulate and motivate the industry to develop treatment for these patient groups. And the main rationale for the regulation was to put the patient into focus, the patients who did not have any access to treatment, and to ensure that they have the same right to treatment as all other patients. And there is a Universal Declaration of Human Rights saying that everyone has the right to the standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including medical care. So before the legislation, there were only a handful of drugs approved for patients with rare diseases. And the legislation includes a process where a drug under development has to fulfill certain criteria. It has to be a disease that fulfills criteria on rarity, and the drug under development also need to contribute to the patient. The orphan drug designation provides pharma company with some incentives during the clinical development of the drug, but also when the drug has received market authorization, and we will go through all these details later on. Just to give a short overview on the Orphan Drug Act or the Orphan Drug legislation, it's called the Orphan Drug Act in the US and the Orphan Drug legislation in Europe. It was put already in place in US 1983 and 2000 in Europe, and I will come back to later on why it was such a delay between US and Europe. But since its implementation in the US, there have been 2,330 number of drugs who have got the designation, and designation meaning that they fulfill the criteria on rarity and what the drug is aiming for. And the same number of designations are 850 in Europe. Of these 350, of the 2,330 in US, 350 and less than 100 have received market authorization in US and Europe. So many of the designated products have not yet got regulatory approval. So is the legislation a success? Yeah, from the perspective of all those patients and families, with those with more than 6,000 diseases who have still not got an orphan drug, I would assume that they would not see the orphan drug legislation as a success. And in the perspective that there are 30 years since it was introduced in the US, there are only therapies for about 3.5% of all the rare diseases. There are several companies developing orphan drugs, and traditionally they were small and middle-sized companies as BioMarin and Amicus. But there are now several big pharmas entering into the field, and maybe that's why there's so much talk about orphan drugs. So will there be a new wave of orphan drugs? If the current failure between number of designations and number of approved drugs is due to limited resources and financial shortcoming in the small and middle-sized companies that initially were in this field, maybe there will be more orphan drugs coming on the market within the coming years. There are many misconceptions around orphan drug legislation. Many think that just get an orphan drug designation mean that the world of opportunities are open. So many think that this is a tool to get access to a shortcut to bring drugs quicker to the market, cheaper, and that you will get a higher price. That there is a higher probability of regulatory approval, and we will talk about that. It's not that easy to get the regulatory approval even if you have an orphan drug designation, and we saw that the differences between number of designations and number of approval, it's probably not that easy. Smaller trial sizes result in lower overall development cost. Yes, low number of patients does not necessarily mean that it's cheaper. And it will also be more difficult to prove that there is an effect of treatment, and we will talk about this. Less clinical development time on average, I wouldn't say that's the case. Less regulatory review time on average, that is not the case either. Once approved for market or the orphan drug will be highly profitable. Maybe some of the first orphan drugs that were approved have been very highly profitable, but today there is an issue to bring orphan drugs out on the market after they have been approved centrally to get them priced and reimbursed, and we will talk about that. The orphan drug market is generally less price sensitive, maybe initially, but things are changing with the pressure on the healthcare system. And orphan products can often be later developed to treat additional disease states, orphan and non-orphan. That has happened for some of the orphan drugs, but that's not the rule. It doesn't mean that because you have got one orphan drug approved for one indication, that it's easy to get a lot of additional diseases approved as well. So this course will cover what are the definitions and the criteria for getting an orphan drug designation, and which are the main steps involved, and where to find more in-depth information. Understand who the players and stakeholders are in the rare orphan disease field and their specific needs and concerns. There are several kind of stakeholder groups that you will not see outside the orphan drug field. So what is rare diseases beyond the prevalence figures and the broad spectrum of diseases that are included in the definition? We will talk about that. We will also get an insight into patient advocacy groups, their engagement for the patients, the direct support they provide, and the big role that they play in driving the policy questions aiming for improving the life for patients with rare diseases. We will also look at an overview on research and policy initiative initiated by, for example, the US Congress and the European Commission. The rare diseases are high on their agenda these days. And we will also look at an overview of the specific rare disease initiatives that are around the world. The hurdles involved in designing robust clinical trials for orphan drugs. We are talking about small patient cohorts, and the market authorization procedure and issues around market and patient access. But I would like to highlight the orphan drug specifics that is really, really strong in the orphan drug and rare disease area. There's a strong partnership between all those involved in the rare disease community of rare diseases. The patients, the industry, the physicians, and also the society. And there are several orphan disease-specific stakeholders, the patient organization taking policy actions, as for example Northern US and Euroris in Europe. We will touch base on them, Orphanet and several other stakeholders. And we will talk about research initiatives on rare diseases.